She was 20 years old, and by the time the first frost silvered the fence posts of Alders Landing, Missouri, in the autumn of 1899, she owned nothing in this world but a carpetbag, $4.60, and a rotting Ferry that no one else would touch. Her uncle, Garrett Voss, had put her out of her father's own smithy not 6 weeks after burying her aunt, telling the whole street that a niece with no husband and no trade was a mouth he could no longer feed, though the truth, unspoken, was that the smithy and the land beneath it were worth more, without her name attached to any of it. She left with what she could carry, and what little cash her father had once hidden behind a loose brick. And when she arrived in this river town with its crooked steeples and its long memory, she spent nearly every last coin of it on a forgotten ferry landing, and the wreck of a boat still chained to its dock, sold at county auction for $11. Because not a single soul in Alders Landing believed it was worth the rope holding it together. They called it cursed. They said the bell mounted on its bow had not rung once in 60 years, not since the spring of 1839, and that some things, once silenced, were silenced for a reason. She thought she was buying scrap lumber and a place to sleep out of the rain. She did not yet know that bolted beneath the rotted deckboards was a truth that had been waiting 6 decades for someone willing to listen to it. A truth that would clear a dead man's name, humble a powerful one, and give this whole grieving river town something it had quietly starved for since before her own mother was born. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Mercy Calloway. If you are watching this from a town that time seems to have passed over, or from a place that people wrote off as too small or too poor or too far gone to matter, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And if stories like this one feel like home to you, we would be grateful if you stayed a while and subscribed to the channel, so you never miss the next one. Mercy Calloway had been born in a town called Pruitt's Fork, a full county away from the river, in the back room of a smithy that smelled always of coal smoke and hot iron and the particular sweetness of beeswax her father used to season new tools. Her father, Thomas Calloway, was not merely a blacksmith, though that was the word the town used for him. He was, more precisely, a bell-caster, one of a dying breed of craftsmen who understood that a bell was not simply a shape of bronze, but a living thing with a voice of its own. A voice that had to be coaxed out of the metal through patience and proportion, and an almost reverent attention to the exact thickness of the wall at the sound bow. He had learned the trade from his own father in Pennsylvania before the family came west, and he passed what he knew to his daughter not because it was customary, for it certainly was not customary for a girl to stand at a forge, but because Mercy's mother had died delivering her, and Thomas Calloway, grieving and solitary, had simply never learned to raise a daughter any other way than as a companion at his side. She grew up with soot under her fingernails and the ring of struck metal as her lullaby. By the time she was 9, she could tell, by ear alone, whether a bell casting held a hidden flaw, a hairline crack invisible to the eye, but audible in the way the tone died too quickly, instead of singing long and clean. Her father used to crouch beside her after such a test, tapping the bronze gently with a small hammer, and say, in that unhurried voice she would carry with her the rest of her life, that every bell wanted to speak, and that a silent bell was not a broken thing so much as a waiting thing, a thing that had simply not yet found the person patient enough to listen for what ailed it and set it right. He said the same about people, sometimes, when he thought she wasn't paying attention, and though she did not understand it then, she would come to understand it with her whole chest, one October many years later. Her father was not a wealthy man, but he was respected, and the smithy provided a modest, steady life until Mercy was 16, when her father took in his late wife's younger sister, a woman named Hattie, after Hattie's own husband died and left her with nothing. Hattie married Mercy's father 2 years later, not out of romance so much as practicality and a genuine fondness that had grown between them. And it was through this marriage that Garrett Voss entered the family, Hattie's brother-in-law from her first marriage. A man with an easy laugh and a way of making himself indispensable in rooms where he had not been invited. Mercy did not trust him from the first season she knew him, though she could never say precisely why. Only that he had a habit of appraising the smithy's tools and the value of the land with his eyes in a way that made her skin prickle, the way she imagined a magpie might eye a nest not its own. Her father, however, was a generous and trusting man, and when his health began to fail in the winter of 1897, it was Garrett who arrived to help manage the accounts. Garrett who sat at her father's bedside with ledgers spread across his knees. And Garrett who was, by the time Thomas Calloway succumbed to a lung fever the following spring, listed as co-holder of the smithy's deed, an arrangement Mercy would later learn her father had signed while fevered and frightened for his daughter's future, believing, wrongly, that it would protect her. It did not protect her. Within a year, Hattie too was gone, taken by a sudden apoplexy that left Mercy entirely without kin who wanted her. And Garrett Voss wasted no time making clear that a woman of 20 with no husband was, in his words, an expense rather than an heir. He sold the smithy's forge and tools to a foundry 2 towns over before Mercy had finished grieving, and when she protested, reminding him that the trade and half the property were rightfully hers by her father's own hand and by the plain justice of blood, he laughed the easy laugh she had never trusted, and told her that paper was paper and blood was sentiment, and that she would do well to remember which one the law recognized. He gave her $4.60, called it generous, and told her the roads west were full of towns that needed a strong back and a willing pair of hands. She left Pruitt's Fork on a hired wagon with her father's few surviving hand tools wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of her carpetbag, the only inheritance no one had thought worth stealing, and she rode 2 full days along the river before the driver let her off at a crossing called Alder's Landing, because that was as far as his route went and her money would not stretch further. Alder's Landing sat where a wide brown bend of the Missouri curled past a bluff crowned with oaks, a town of perhaps 1,100 souls with a church, a mercantile, a schoolhouse, and a covered toll bridge that had been built some 20 years prior. A bridge that Mercy would soon learn was the pride and the purse of a family named Crane. What the town did not have, and had not had in living memory for most of its younger residents, was a working ferry, though there had once been one. And the old landing where it used to dock sat, abandoned at the river's edge below the bluff, its dock timbers silvered and split. Its boat, they called it the Ferry 60, though no one could say for certain why, chained and half sunk in the shallows, green with river moss, and mounted at its bow. Dulled by 6 decades of weather, but unmistakably a bell, cast in bronze, its clapper hanging motionless inside it, like a tongue that had forgotten how to speak. Mercy learned of the auction her second morning in town, standing outside the mercantile, reading a notice pinned to the board announcing that the county, weary of carrying the abandoned landing on its tax rolls, would sell the property and the vessel upon it to whoever offered the highest bid that Saturday, with a reserve of no less than $5, since, the clerk told her plainly, no one in 30 years had wanted it for any price at all. She asked why, and the clerk, an older man named Purdy, who ran the counter with the slow patience of someone who had told this story many times, looked at her for a long moment before he answered. He said that the ferry had gone down, or near enough, in the spring flood of 1839. that 6 children from the schoolhouse had drowned when the crossing rope gave way in high water, that the ferryman at the time, a man named Elias Bragg, had been blamed for it, driven from town in disgrace within the week, and that the bell, which by long custom the ferryman rang each time he left the near shore, had never been rung again by anyone since, because the town had come to believe, in the peculiar superstitious grief of small places, that to ring it again would be to call back that terrible night, or worse, to call back something else entirely. Mercy thanked him and said nothing more, but she found herself walking down to the bluff that same afternoon, and standing above the wreck of the old ferry with the autumn wind coming up cold off the water. She felt something she could not name, something that reminded her of standing beside her father's forge as a girl, listening for the flaw in a casting that everyone else had already given up on. The auction that Saturday was a small, half-hearted affair attended mostly out of curiosity. When the county man called for bids, silence answered him twice before Mercy, standing at the back in her traveling coat with her whole fortune folded in her glove, raised her hand and offered $5, the reserve exactly, and no one in the small crowd bid against her. Some out of pity for the strange young woman, who apparently did not know better. And some, she would later learn, out of a genuine relief that someone else might finally be willing to take the cursed old landing off the county's books. The clerk went to $11 only because Mercy, feeling the weight of every eye upon her, raised her own bid twice more, simply to make it look less like charity and more like commerce. And by the time the gavel fell, she owned, for the whole of her inheritance, minus a single $1.40, an abandoned ferry dock, a half-sunk boat, and a bell that no one wanted to hear ring. She spent her first nights in Alder's Landing sleeping in the boat itself, having patched the worst of the leaks with tar she bought on credit from Purdy's Mercantile. And it was on the 4th night, working by lantern light to clear the silted debris from beneath the stern deckboards, that her crowbar struck something that did not sound like river mud or rotted wood, but rang, faintly, like metal. She dug with her hands until her fingers found the edge of an oilcloth bundle, buried deep and wedged so tightly beneath a false plank that it had clearly been placed there by someone who wanted it kept, not lost. And when she drew it up into the lantern light and unwrapped it with trembling care, she found inside a small tin dispatch box, rusted at the hinges but sealed with wax that had somehow held, and within the box, wrapped again in oiled paper, a leather logbook and a single folded letter addressed, in a careful, aging hand, simply to whoever finds this. She did not sleep the rest of that night. The letter, when she finally worked the brittle wax free and unfolded it by lantern light, was written by Elias Bragg himself, dated the autumn of 1839, mere months after the tragedy that had ended his life in Alder's Landing, as surely as if the river itself had taken him too. He wrote, in a hand that grew unsteady toward the end of each line, that he had not been drunk that night as the town believed, that the crossing rope had not simply frayed with age as everyone assumed, but had been cut, deliberately and cleanly, on the upstream side where no one but a man who knew boats would think to look, and that he had discovered the cut edge himself 2 days after the drowning, alone, kneeling in the mud where the rope had washed ashore, and had understood in that moment that someone in Alder's Landing had wanted his ferry to fail. He named no one directly in the letter, whether from fear or from lack of proof Mercy could not yet tell, but he wrote that he had buried what evidence he had, along with certain funds he had been saving toward the building of a proper schoolhouse for the town's children, funds he could no longer in good conscience use for himself, beneath the very landing where the ferry had always docked, in the hope that someday, when the town was ready to hear it, someone honest would find it and see that justice, however late, still mattered. He wrote that he silenced the bell himself before he left, not out of superstition, but out of grief so total he could not bear the thought of anyone else ringing it in his place. And he asked, in the letter's final line, that whoever found these words would ring it again only once they knew the whole truth, and were prepared to see it through. Mercy sat with the letter in her lap until the lantern guttered low, and she found herself thinking of her father's hands guiding hers around a small hammer, his voice telling her that a silent bell was not broken, only waiting, and she understood, with a certainty that settled into her chest like a keel finding water, that she had not stumbled onto a curse at all. She had stumbled onto an unfinished promise. The logbook told her more in the days that followed, for Elias Bragg had been a meticulous man, and its pages recorded not only ferry crossings and fares, but small observations of town life, including several entries in the weeks before the drowning noting the persistent visits of a man named Josiah Crane, who had, Bragg wrote with evident irritation, offered 3 times to buy out the ferry rights outright so that he might build a toll bridge in its place, and who had grown, in Bragg's words, considerably less friendly each time Bragg refused him. Mercy walked into town the next morning and asked Purdy, as casually as she could manage, about the Crane family, and learned that Josiah Crane's grandson, a man named Silas Crane, now ran the very toll bridge that spanned the river a half-mile upstream. The same bridge, she realized with a chill, that a working ferry would once again make unnecessary for anyone unwilling to pay Crane's toll. Purdy told her, lowering his voice though the store was empty, that the Cranes had built their fortune and their standing in Alder's Landing almost entirely on that bridge, and that Silas Crane was not a man who took kindly to competition, real or remembered. It did not take long for Silas Crane to notice the young woman living aboard the old ferry. He came to the landing himself less than a week after the auction, a broad, well-dressed man with a courteous manner that did not quite reach his eyes, and offered to buy the landing from her outright, at $20, nearly double what she had paid, framing it as a kindness to a young woman clearly in over her head. Mercy, who had not yet decided how much of what she knew she was prepared to reveal, declined politely, saying only that she intended to repair the old vessel and see whether the crossing might still serve the town. Crane's courtesy thinned visibly at that, and he told her, in the mild tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed, that a ferry crossing so near his bridge would not be good for anyone, least of all her, and that Alder's Landing did not take kindly to strangers stirring up old griefs best left buried. He left without raising his voice, but Mercy stood on the dock a long while after his carriage had gone, understanding that she had just been warned, and understanding, too, that the warning itself told her more than any page of the logbook could. She spent the following weeks working the landing by day and studying the logbook by lantern light at night. And slowly, carefully, she began to piece together not only the shape of the sabotage, but the shape of her own resolve. She was, after all, a bellcaster's daughter, and she knew that the bronze bell still mounted at the ferry's bow, though silent and green with age, was not beyond saving. She cleaned the corrosion from it herself over patient evenings, using vinegar and fine sand and the gentle, unhurried touch her father had taught her, and when she finally struck it, softly, with the flat of her palm one cold November evening, she heard beneath the dullness a true, clear tone waiting there, exactly as her father always said a silent bell would hold, if only someone cared enough to listen for it properly. She found, too, working her way along the buried footings of the old dock exactly as Bragg's letter had described, a second cache wrapped in oilcloth and sealed in a small iron strongbox, containing not a fortune, but enough, nearly $300 in coin, carefully saved across years of modest ferry fares, along with a hand-drawn plan for a one-room schoolhouse Elias Bragg had evidently hoped to build for the children of Alder's Landing. The very kind of children he had lost that terrible spring night and never stopped grieving. Word travels quickly along a river, and it was not long before whispers reached town that the strange young woman at the old landing had been seen scraping rust from the bell, and quicker still, before those whispers reached Silas Crane. He returned to the landing a second time, no longer courteous, accompanied by two of his hired men, and told Mercy plainly that she would sell the landing to him by month's end, or he would see to it personally that no bank in 3 counties extended her $1 of credit, that no merchant in Alder's Landing would sell her supply, and that she would find herself, before the winter was through, with nothing at all but a rotting boat and a debt she could not pay. Mercy, standing her ground on the dock with the November wind pulling at her coat, told him she had found Elias Bragg's letter and watched something flicker and harden behind Silas Crane's eyes, though he said only, in a voice gone very quiet, that dead men's letters proved nothing to a judge, and that she would be wise to remember whose grandfather still owned the bridge that fed half the commerce in this town. He left her that day with the clear understanding that he did not intend to let the matter rest, and Mercy spent that night not in fear so much as in the same steady, deliberate calculation her father had once used to judge whether a cracked bell could be saved or must be melted down and begun again. She decided, in the end, on the truth, spoken plainly and in front of everyone, because she understood that a secret kept quiet, however righteous, protected no one, and that Elias Bragg had asked, in his own last written words, for someone honest to see the matter through, not merely to profit quietly from what they found. She wrote to the county recorder in the seat town, requesting the original survey records of the Ferry crossing rights, and learned, as she suspected, that those rights had never legally transferred to Crane's Bridge Company at all, having been granted in perpetuity to whoever held the ferry landing itself, a legal technicality Josiah Crane had evidently hoped no one would ever trouble to examine, and that his grandson Silas had spent 2 decades quietly assuming was long forgotten. Armed with the logbook, the letter, the recovered funds, and the recorder's confirmation, Mercy asked Purdy, who she had come to trust across her weeks in town, to help her post a notice at the Mercantile and the church, inviting the whole of Alder's Landing to gather at the old landing the following Sunday afternoon, promising only that they would hear, at long last, the truth of what happened on the river 60 years before. More people came than Mercy expected, drawn by curiosity and by the particular pull small towns feel toward old wounds finally given air. And she stood on the repaired dock with the logbook in her hands and read Elias Bragg's letter aloud to the gathered crowd in a voice that did not shake, though her heart hammered the entire time. And she told them of the cut rope and the funds saved for a schoolhouse never built, and the man who had visited the ferryman so many times in the weeks before the tragedy offering to buy him out. She did not need to say Josiah Crane's name for the older residents in the crowd to remember it themselves, several of them murmuring aloud that they recalled the old rumors, long dismissed, that the crossing rope had looked strange to whoever found it, and one elderly woman, in fact, stepped forward from the crowd to say she remembered, as a girl, her own father whispering that very suspicion before being told firmly to hold his tongue, for Crane money paid half the wages in this town even then. Silas Crane, present near the back of the gathering, went pale and then furious in quick succession, and tried to shout the whole account down as the fantasy of a grief-stricken drunkard's letter. But the county recorder's confirmation of the crossing rights, which Mercy produced next, silenced him more thoroughly than any accusation could, for it proved beyond his denying that his family's bridge tolls had been collected for 2 decades on a crossing that legally belonged, and had always belonged, to the ferry landing itself. What followed was not the violent reckoning of dime novels, but the slower, sturdier justice of a community remembering itself. The town elders, moved as much by the tragedy of the drowned children as by the fraud finally exposed, voted within the month to revoke the bridge's exclusive toll charter, opening the crossing to both bridge and ferry alike, and returning a share of years of collected tolls to the town's own school fund, a decision that cost Silas Crane the better part of his fortune, and very nearly all of his standing, though no one laid a hand on him, for Mercy had insisted, standing before the town council herself, that the point was never to ruin a man but to restore what had been stolen, and to finally, properly grieve and honor what had been lost. Elias Bragg's name was cleared publicly, his account entered into the town record beside the very children he had died a broken man trying to protect the memory of, and Mercy used the recovered funds, together with a portion of the return tolls the town voted to add, to finally build the one-room schoolhouse Bragg had drawn plans for 60 years before, naming it, at the insistence of the town council rather than her own suggestion, the Bragg School, with a small bronze plaque by the door telling, briefly, the true story of the man who had given his savings and his good name for children he never got the chance to teach. On the morning the schoolhouse opened its doors the following spring, Mercy stood once more upon the dock of the old ferry landing, the vessel itself now sturdy and freshly caulked, ready at last to carry passengers across the river again for the first time in 60 years, and she reached up and took hold of the bell rope with both hands, the same bell she had scraped clean by lantern light through a long, uncertain winter, believing, as her father had taught her to believe, that nothing struck true was ever truly beyond saving. She thought, in that moment, of Thomas Calloway's hands guiding her small ones around a hammer, and of Elias Bragg's unsteady final words, asking only that whoever found his letter would see the truth through to its end. And she understood that she had spent her whole short life, without quite knowing it, being prepared for precisely this. She pulled the rope, and the bell rang out clear and full and unbroken across the water. The same true tone her father always promised was hiding inside every silent thing, waiting only for someone patient enough to listen. The children gathered for the schoolhouse's opening day cheered from the bluff above, and the older townsfolk who remembered the tragedy of 1839 wept quietly where they stood. And Mercy Calloway, 20 years old, cast out with nothing but a carpetbag and a handful of coins, stood at last not as the town's strange newcomer, but as the woman who had listened to what everyone else called worthless and found, underneath the rust and the silence, exactly what Alder's Landing had been waiting 60 years to hear. She had come to this river town believing she was buying nothing more than shelter from the cold, a rotted boat and a dock no one else wanted, purchased for $11, because the whole of Alder's Landing had long ago decided the old ferry landing held nothing but bad memory and worse luck. What she found instead was a dead man's unfinished promise, patient as bronze beneath river mud, waiting 60 years for someone with the same steady hands and the same stubborn faith her father had given her, someone willing to listen past the silence to the true note underneath. Mercy Calloway never became a wealthy woman, not by the town's usual measure of it, for she gave away nearly everything she recovered to the school and the crossing, and the memory of a man she never met. But she became, within a few short years, the keeper of the Alder's Landing ferry. Its bell rung faithfully each dawn and dusk exactly as Elias Bragg once rang it. A sound the whole town came to listen for the way one listens for a heartbeat. Proof that something long silenced had finally been given back its voice. We thank you so very much for spending this time with us and with Mercy's story today. If it moved you even a little, We would be so grateful if you would share it with someone who might need a quiet reminder that overlooked things and overlooked people often carry more worth than the world is willing to see at first glance. And if you haven't already, please consider following or subscribing to our channel so you never miss the next story we bring to you. Before you go, we'd love to know in the comments below about a time in your own life when you found real value in something, or perhaps someone, that everyone else had already written off. We read every single one, and they mean more to us than you know. Until next time, stay close.